Folks in Egypt are accusing Netflix of misrepresenting history in Netflix's new docuseries called Queen Cleopatra.
Cleopatra was Greek. When you look up sculptures of Cleopatra, not looking like a black person to me. Even if you look up her siblings, come on now. Homeboy ain't black. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, girl. Cleopatra was Greek.
Seeing black faces on white bodies is not representation.
Culturally, African Americans have no connection to ancient Egypt whatsoever. We're trying to find a sense of belonging in a culture we're not even a part of.
This is their idea of being inclusive.
The notion that Cleopatra was black is silly. I mean, again, you're allowed to do this in Hollywood.
What's wrong with Netflix showing Cleopatra as a black woman? Well, one, she wasn't.
She was Greek. She was Macedonian. We know this. How can you not know this?
Is Netflix accurate in the depiction of Cleopatra being black?
To have curly hair like me and a similar skin color.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
It's not about white and black. This is a very reductive way to talk about things. This is the way that Americans talk about it. I'm very sorry. Like, I come from Egypt. Egypt has a very diverse color palette.
See, the Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek. Cleopatra's parents committed incest. They were both members of the same dynasty and were extremely closely related.
The stories that white people, young, ignorant white people like to tell is that she was just Macedonian and the Macedonian line were incestuous, and so therefore there was no out. It's bullshit.
And the Macedonians who ruled in Egypt were famously worried about mixing with Egyptians. They didn't even learn Egyptian until Cleopatra.
The native Egyptians had a long history of intermarriage with the Ptolemies. That means that the Ptolemies were not fully Macedonian and fully Greek. They were mixed.
So the thing is, like, we are the only people who are not allowed to tell our own. We are the only people who are not allowed to talk about our own history.
Do you guys agree with this guy right here, or do you?
And the thing is, even like historically wise, you see in the trailer, it's like, I don't care what they told you, but Cleopatra was black. Who's that woman? Why is African American people are telling my own history? She is there's all of these pseudoscience and pseudo history has been going on, and it has implications.
The culture war is home to many battlefronts, but out of all of them, there's perhaps no flashpoint as bloody as the one that's been raging all across the hellscape that is modern media and entertainment. By this point, the lines in the sand have been drawn, and there's often very little room for nuance or agreement. Hardly anyone agrees on anything. However, there have been those few rare exceptions where both sides, or at least factions from both sides, have come together in agreement to say, wow, this is a terrible idea. HBO's recent Velma series is probably the most notable recent example, and for once, both audiences and critics alike, who've been at odds with each other for the better part of the past half a decade, finally agreed that, yes, it was a terrible idea. We've also seen this more recently with the announcement and subsequent release of Netflix's new documentary about Egyptian ruler Cleopatra, part of the streaming platform's new African Queen series, produced and narrated by the ever-so-esteemed actress of Nutty Professor and Madagascar fame, Jada Pinkett Smith. Starring in the titular role is British actress Adele James, who is of mixed African and English heritage, a casting decision that seemed to come as a shock to everybody, but really should have come as a surprise to no one. Race-washing is nothing new in Hollywood. From John Wayne as Genghis Khan to Laurence Olivier as Othello, and even as recently as Johnny Depp's portrayal of Tonto in 2013's critically panned Lone Ranger remake, the act of casting white actors in non-white roles is a tradition that goes as far back as the earliest days of cinema. Naturally, it's also a practice that's been subject to intense criticism, especially in recent decades. Some of these casting decisions, while perhaps inappropriate by today's standards, have been largely inoffensive, if not even praised, such as Sir Alec Guinness's portrayal of Prince Faisal in 1962's Lawrence of Arabia. Others haven't aged nearly as well, to put it lightly, as is the case with Mickey Rooney's infamous performance as Mr. Yunioshi in 1961's Breakfast at Tiffany's.
You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell! You disturb me!
Now, was the decision to cast Rooney appropriate? Probably not. Was his performance insensitive? Undoubtedly. Was it hilarious? Absolutely. Was it wrong? By the standards of the time, let alone those of today. I'd say so. But two wrongs don't make a right. In recent years, we've witnessed a phenomenon where non-white actors have been cast in the roles of characters which, in context, should otherwise belong to white actors. If it works within the context of the story itself, that's one thing. Things can easily be explained away when it comes to fiction. Take HBO's hit shows Game of Thrones and The House of the Dragon, which, though predominantly set in a land that is effectively a fictionalized version of 15th century Europe, have featured diverse casts. However, the casting of these characters is deliberate and fits their respective backstories. Even for works featuring historical figures, this can work within reason, as is the case with Lin-Manuel Miranda's hit musical Hamilton, which, regardless of your feelings on the production itself or its casting philosophy, explicitly engaged in colorblind casting as a part of the show's wider subversive gimmick. However, we've also witnessed a trend where people of color have been cast in roles where it does not work, even within the context of the stories that are being depicted. One of the first major examples of this was the decision to cast a black actor as Achilles in the Netflix series Troy: Fall of a City, even when Achilles is explicitly stated to be fair of skin and blonde of hair. Therefore, this casting decision explicitly goes against what is directly stated in the show's own source material. But politicrat, a defender of this casting might say, it's not history, it's mythology. Into this, despite it being European mythology, I might be willing to concede. Next, there's Amazon Prime's $715 million blunder, The Rings of Power, which cast a black actress in the role of a dwarven queen and a black actor as an elf, both native to a world based on Anglo-Saxon mythology. Oh, but politicrat, a defender of this casting might say, it's not history, it's just fantasy. And to this point, despite these characters being based on figures taken from English folklore, I might also be willing to begrudgingly concede. Next we come to the decision to cast a mixed-race actress as Queen Charlotte in Netflix's Bridgerton, a show I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But politicrat, a defender of the casting might say, the show's casting was purposefully colorblind, and some accounts claim that the historical Queen Charlotte had 1/16th black ancestry. And to this point, mostly because I don't care about Bridgerton, I might be willing to roll my eyes and concede. And then there's 2021's Vikings Valhalla, also by Netflix, notice the trend here, which cast a black actress in the role of a Viking Jarl. But politicrat, a defender of this casting might say, she's not a real historical figure. Maybe the plot has a convenient explanation for the historically unrealistic scenario of placing a character of African descent as the leader of a group of Vikings. To which I might be willing to bang my head against a wall and concede. Finally, we have Channel 5's 2021 miniseries Anne Boleyn, which cast a black actress in the role of the 16th century English queen from Norfolk. Oh, but politicrat, a defender of this casting might say, this might be historical, but it's not like it's a documentary. It's just fiction, to which I might be willing to down a couple of shots of Sailor Jerry's and get myself drunk enough so that I may, again, concede. From the moment it dropped, the trailer told us all we need to know about the express purpose of the documentary, which seems to place a heavy emphasis on Cleopatra's racial identity. According to producer Jada Pinkett Smith, the motivation for the documentary is to represent black women, because, in her words, we don't often get to see or hear stories about black queens, and that was really important for me, as well as for my daughter, and just for my community to be able to know those stories because there are tons of them. The sad part is that we don't have ready access to these historical women who were so powerful and were the backbones of African nations. Taken out of context, there's really nothing wrong with what she's saying. The sentiment behind these words is frankly not incorrect, and is even rather understandable. However, this isn't a general statement, as she's specifically saying this with direct regard to the Cleopatra series. If the purpose of her project is to represent black women, then why make an entire 4-part series about an African queen, quote-unquote, who was not black, when the intent of the project is to showcase the story of black queens? There are only 2 possible explanations, and neither are particularly acceptable, especially for a series that marks itself as a historical documentary. The first of these is ignorance and/or incompetence. It is entirely possible that the makers of this series, for whatever reason, have absolutely no basic knowledge of the ethnic history of Egypt or North Africa at large, and demographically lump its pre-Arab population together with the people of sub-Saharan Africa, the native population of which is and always has been largely, if not entirely, black. However, even the most basic knowledge of Egyptian or African history is enough to cure such ignorance, and I find it highly unlikely that the creators of a big-budget, quote-unquote, documentary series would be so ignorant as to overlook the readily available information that would demonstrate otherwise. Were someone to propose the creation of a documentary series based on such an assumption, I'd hardly imagine it would get greenlit in the first place. The second and far more obvious assumption would be that the creators have a deeper, deliberate political motivation rooted in the ideology of Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism is nothing new, and the narrative that the ancient Egyptians were black goes back many decades, and has remained a popular one within some elements of the African American community. Afrocentrism is the idea that all of Africa's major civilizations were the product of black Africans, and that this supposed truth has been covered up by Europeans as a part of a coordinated conspiracy to diminish the cultural achievements of black Africans. The idea gained popularity during the mid to late 20th century as an attempt to quote-unquote reclaim Africa's stolen heritage, as much of its history was either erased or appropriated by white colonizers. This narrative has been universally debunked by historians and archaeologists, and is not taken seriously by any serious scholars. Yet it's a narrative that continues to remain popular in a certain segment of the black community, despite all evidence to the contrary. And the trailer for Netflix's Cleopatra all but indicates that this is the perspective being taken. The creators of the series state that the reason for casting James as Cleopatra was to acknowledge the ongoing debate regarding Cleopatra's ancestry, to paraphrase. The thing is, though, there's not a debate. There was never a debate. Any historian who's ever claimed that Cleopatra was black has been almost unanimously regarded as fringe. This so-called debate was never anything more than a sideshow amongst a litany of far more serious and mature discussions regarding the nature of history. While it's both factual and regrettable that so much of African history has been lost, whether due to destruction by Europeans or some other array of reasons, that does not make this kind of pseudo-historical revisionism any more justified. Ancient Egypt was its own civilization, both ethnically and culturally, distinct from any other culture around today or which has previously existed, and to claim otherwise, especially in a big-budget production that claims to be a historically factual documentary, is both irresponsible and dangerous. As is the case with most regions around the world, it's difficult to know exactly when the first humans arrived in ancient Egypt. However, most paleontologists estimate, if we are to assume that the out-of-Africa theory is indeed correct, that the earliest Homo sapiens arrived in the region around 200,000 years ago. These peoples, like all Homo sapiens at the time, were nomadic and lacked anything resemblant to that of a high culture. Thus, they did not actually settle down in the region until much later. The peoples who would be the ancestors of who we now refer to today as the ancient Egyptians began establishing permanent settlements around the Nile River somewhere between 10,000 and 6,000 BC at the start of the Neolithic period. While various theories exist surrounding where these people came from, it is most likely that they migrated from the fertile lands that once covered the region that is now the Sahara Desert, likely due to the process of desertification that it was undergoing during that time frame. Another theory suggests that they might have been Proto-Semitic nomads who migrated southward from the Fertile Crescent. Most likely is it that it was a combination of the two, and that the early Egyptians were not of any one singular origin, these migrations having occurred in a series of waves over many thousands of years. The ethnogenesis of the ancient Egyptian culture would have been the result of a gradual gestation that ensued throughout the duration of the Neolithic period. Although the term has largely fallen out of use, the race of peoples who inhabited ancient Egypt have been historically referred to as Hamites, as they were believed to be the descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, who is reported to have migrated to and subsequently settled in the lands of Egypt following the Great Flood in ancient Mesopotamia. Despite the various theories pertaining to the origin of these Hamites, it is widely accepted that this distinct ethnic group was lighter in complexion compared to the Semitic peoples of the Near East, though not as fair-skinned as Europeans and Persians, constituting their own distinct ethno-linguistic group. Ethnically speaking, their closest modern relatives are believed to be the Berbers of North Africa, and it's likely that the ancient Egyptian peoples appeared not too dissimilar to this group of people. By around 3350 BC, the Egyptians had managed to establish a distinct and complex high culture of their own, and by 3100 BC had become united under a single polity, marking the beginning of the dynastic period which lasted until about 700 BC. When we imagine ancient Egypt, it is typically this time frame that we think of. Egyptian civilization as we know it came to an end around this time, when it was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Although the Egyptian high culture had ceased to exist, many of its customs remained preserved, including the use of the traditional title of Pharaoh. However, no native Egyptian would ever again claim this title. The title of Pharaoh instead became bestowed upon the ruler of whichever empire occupied Egypt at the given time, first by the Assyrians, followed by the Babylonians, and then by the Persians. During the latter half of the 4th century BC, the title of Pharaoh was claimed by Alexander the Great. Following his death, his short-lived Greek empire was divided between 4 of the late conqueror's most senior generals, with the lands of Egypt being claimed by Ptolemy, who established the eponymous Ptolemaic dynasty, which would go on to rule Egypt for the better part of 3 centuries. During this time, Egypt became subject to a gradual process of Hellenization. By the 1st century, the final vestiges of the traditional Egyptian culture had all but vanished, with the title of Pharaoh remaining the only tie that its new Greek culture had to that of the traditional civilization. By all historical standards, the ancient Egyptians were not black Africans, as Afrocentrists so ardently insist. However, that's not to say that they were completely foreign or unconnected to the Egyptian culture. As Egypt's cultural sphere expanded southward, it came to influence a handful of sub-Saharan cultures, such as those of Nubia and Kush, whose peoples came to adopt Egyptian customs, writing, institutions, and architecture, until they, for all intents and purposes, became subsumed within the wider civilization. But were these people Egyptians? Well, it all depends on how you choose to define Egyptian. Culturally, one could certainly make that argument, but ethnically, it'd be hard to argue that they were. While it's true that there was some biological overlap in the lands of Upper Egypt, racial intermixing did not occur between anyone higher than the local nobility. And because the periphery vassals and subjects were not of traditional Egyptian lineage, and the fact that Egyptian royals prioritized maintaining the purity of their bloodlines, we can be certain that no one of sub-Saharan descent ever claimed the title of pharaoh during or prior to the dynastic period. Now, to say that there were no black pharaohs whatsoever would be technically incorrect. In the final days of the Egyptian civilization, the Nubians of Sudan, seeing the chaos as opportunity, launched a successful invasion of Upper Egypt and established the short-lived 25th dynasty. History now knows them as the Black Pharaohs. However, when the Afrocentrists argue that ancient Egypt was ruled by black Africans, they're not referring to this short period of Kushite dominance, but Egypt as a whole. They argue that it was black Africans who built Egyptian civilization, not that they simply conquered and occupied its ruins for a brief period of time. Their argument extends beyond that, and reductively categorizes the entire extent of Egyptian history, from its genesis and through the Roman annexation, as being characterized by African rule. This would be comparatively more forgivable if they stopped at the 7th century, but that is not the case. They conveniently ignore the centuries-long series of occupations beginning with the Assyrians and ending with the Ptolemaic Greeks, even though we are even significantly more certain about the ethnic identity of the Egyptian pharaohs during this period than we are about those of the dynastic period. And none of them were black. The show contradicts itself several times when it attempts to break down the ethnic makeup of Ptolemaic Egypt in the 1st century BC. The show states that the kingdom could be divided into 3 distinct racial categories: native Egyptians, Greeks, and Jews. Now, there are several things wrong with this. The first is that it is incredibly simplistic. Lower Egypt was home to many different ethnicities during the Hellenistic period, and Alexandria itself could be characterized as a world city, much in the same vein as Babylon, Carthage, or Rome. The population included of those from all corners of the known world, everyone from Semites to Persians to people from all across Europe. It's interesting that they named the Jews as being a major ethnic group in Egypt at the time, when they were, in fact, actually a minority. And while the Jewish population was much larger back then than it is today, it still wasn't a major racial group. Much like the ancient Israelites who came before them, the Jews were a Semitic people, almost genetically identical to the Assyrians or the Babylonians. The documentary is correct when naming the 2 dominant groups in the region during this period, the native Egyptians and the Greeks. However, the native Egyptians in the series are almost unanimously depicted as sub-Saharan, and as we've previously mentioned, the native Egyptians were far more closely related to the North Africans of today. Even more confusing is that they point out that Cleopatra was Macedonian Greek, yet they still depict her as black and not Greek. In doing this, they're fundamentally contradicting their own logic, as they explicitly noted that Cleopatra was ethnically Greek and not native Egyptian. Seeing as how they characterize native Egyptians as black and state that Cleopatra was not, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now, if we were to go off and list every single historical mischaracterization in this documentary, we'd be here all day. And, while I'd be happy to make a future video breaking down each and every one of them if there's enough interest, that's not the larger point of this particular video. Instead, I'd like to go ahead and address the overarching dubious political implications underlying the reason behind why this alleged documentary was produced. On April 21st, 2023, in response to the initial backlash that the project received when it was first announced, a backlash that was likely unexpected by the creators given the positive reception that the media has typically held towards recent attempts at blackwashing, the series director, Tina Gavari, wrote a piece for Variety addressing her decision behind the casting. Now, I'm not going to go over the entirety of the article, but there are a number of questionable statements that Miss Gavari, a woman of Persian descent, makes that allude to the underlying political motivation behind the making of her series. In her first attempt to justify the casting of Miss James, Miss Gavari writes, Cleopatra's heritage has been attributed at one time or another to the Greeks, the Macedonians, and the Persians. The known facts are that her Macedonian Greek family, the Ptolemaic lineage, intermarried with West Asia's Seleucid dynasty and had been in Egypt for 300 years. Cleopatra was 8 generations away from these Ptolemaic ancestors, making the chance of her being white somewhat unlikely. After 300 years, we can safely say that Cleopatra was Egyptian. She was no more Greek or Macedonian than Rita Wilson or Jennifer Aniston. Both are 1 generation removed from Greece. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, even from this single statement. To her credit, Miss Gavari does make some factual statements. However, complementing these truths are a good several inaccuracies, and lies by omission. First of all, she states that Cleopatra's heritage has been attributed, quote-unquote, at one time or another to the Greeks, the Macedonians, and the Persians. Her use of the phrase, at one time or another, might be the most dubious part of this statement. Every historian for the past 2,000 years has acknowledged her Greek ancestry. There's never been any debate, nor any period in time where this was ever seriously questioned. This is also the very first time that I've ever heard of Cleopatra's ancestry being linked to the Persians. And this is because it never was. Now, it's possible that she may have had some slight Persian ancestry early on, but whatever Persian blood she may have had is not significant enough for her to be considered Persian in any meaningful sense. It's also unlikely that any possible Persian ancestry she might have had, which is in no way a known fact, as Miss Gavari claims, would have actually been Persian in the ethnic sense. Like the Ptolemaic dynasty, the ruling class of the Seleucid Empire similarly comprised of Greek conquerors. King Seleucus I, the founder of the Seleucid dynasty, was, like Ptolemy, a former general of Alexander the Great, and, like Ptolemy, wanted to keep his lineage pure. Thus any potential Seleucid ancestry that Cleopatra might have had would have also been ethnically Greek. This is also a clear example of gaslighting on behalf of the director, as she fails to mention this very important point. What she also fails to mention is the fact that the Ptolemies too, in an attempt to maintain their bloodline, interbred with one another. So either way, regardless of whether she had any Seleucid ancestry, Cleopatra would have been ethnically Greek all the same. On top of that, even if Cleopatra had ethnic Persian ancestry, that would still make her 100% white, as Iranians, or Aryans as they were originally known as, come from the Caucasus, and are genetically far closer to Europeans than they are to the rest of the Middle East. Being a Persian woman, she of all people should know this. If not, it's a pity that Miss Gavari doesn't understand her own history. In another attempt at gaslighting, the director states that we can safely say that Cleopatra was Egyptian, yet she fails to elaborate what she means by the word Egyptian. Ethnically Egyptian? Culturally Egyptian? Nationally Egyptian? She makes no distinction. As we've previously established, we can safely say that Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian. Now, in the national sense, we can probably justify calling Cleopatra Egyptian, but only because she was born there and served as its ruler. Hence, she would have been Egyptian in the same way that Richard the Lionheart, a French-speaking Norman, was English. Another baseless claim that Gavari makes later on is that historians can confirm that Cleopatra looked more like Adele James than Elizabeth Taylor ever did. This is categorically untrue. Now, while I have no doubt that Taylor probably bore little resemblance to the historical Cleopatra, the casting of a European actress such as Taylor is still nonetheless far more accurate than the casting of Adele James, for the sole reason that both had fair skin and had 100% European ancestry. Comparatively, Taylor would have looked far closer to Cleopatra than Adele James. So Gavari is either extremely confused or an outright liar. Was Cleopatra black? She asks rhetorically. We don't know for sure, but we can be certain that she wasn't white like Elizabeth Taylor. But we do know for sure. And while she's correct in saying that she wasn't white like Elizabeth Taylor, we do know for sure that she was white. And we can be certain that she wasn't black like Adele James. Why shouldn't Cleopatra be a melanated sister? She once more rhetorically asks. And why do some people need Cleopatra to be white? And to this I would like to pose a rhetorical question of my own in return. Why do some people need Cleopatra to be black? That's the real question we should be asking, not the other way around. For the sole reason that Cleopatra was of Greek descent. Should that not be the default casting? According to Miss Gavari and her bizarre logic, apparently not. She claims in the following paragraph that the casting was colorblind, and that James was chosen based on her ability, but what she leaves out is the fact that she clearly went out of her way to cast a woman of color in the role. And why is that? Well, she makes that explicitly clear early on in the article. Her exact words are, and I quote, "What a political act it would be to see Cleopatra portrayed by a black actress." And there it is, straight from the horse's mouth, confirming what just about everybody suspected. The decision is political. Now, while part of me can't help but respect the utter shamelessness of this claim, the truth is nonetheless disgusting. The director's admitting to an attempted falsification of history at the expense of history itself. And while it's certainly possible to, for the lack of a better term, sympathize with the reason, that reason being to highlight black history, this excuse doesn't even come close to justifying the manner in which the makers of this series are going about doing so, or trying to do so in this case. Now, I'm not and never have been the type of person to go around crying racism around every corner, or accusing everything and anything of being anti-white, but with regards to the latter, I honestly can't think of any other possible explanation as to why this might be. So, in this case, to label this casting decision as being anything but, however inconvenient it might be for some people to admit, would be thoroughly dishonest. Yet there's one group of people that those who are responsible for the making of this series arguably harm the most, which is, ironically, the black community itself. By making an entire series that falsely characterizes Cleopatra as a black queen, the creators are doing so at the expense of actual black African leaders whose stories are potentially just as interesting. And in doing so, the implication here is that actual sub-Saharan African history isn't as interesting or as important as that of white Europeans, which would seemingly go against the stated purpose of Netflix's project. I, for one, would be thoroughly interested in learning about the histories of more obscure peoples and places. The story of Cleopatra has been told countless times before, and while her story is certainly a fascinating one, does it really need to be told again, especially when there are so many other stories that haven't yet been told? Why not use Cleopatra's massive budget to tell the story of Amina of Zaria, the 16th century Nigerian warrior queen who supposedly led her troops into battle on horseback and managed to extend her late father's kingdom throughout North Africa? Why not depict the story of Ya Asantewaa, Queen Mother of the Ashanti Empire, who in 1900 oversaw a massive campaign to rid Ghana of British imperial rule? Why not make a documentary on the life of Queen Amanarina, a contemporary of Cleopatra who mounted a successful invasion of Upper Egypt in 25 BC and led a 3-year campaign in what was an initially successful attempt to push back against Roman expansion south of Egypt? Or, if you really insist on a documentary about black Egyptians, how about one about the various queens and priestesses of the 25th dynasty? There are plenty of African queens whose stories have yet to be told. So I ask you, producers of Netflix's Queen Cleopatra, why blackwash the fair-skinned Cleopatra and ignore other female African leaders who are just as interesting? Is it because you don't think these important figures are nearly as fascinating? Is it because you want to appropriate the history of another nation in an attempt to gaslight the public out of spite? Or are you simply too lazy to do the research? Because if it's none of those, then I see absolutely no reason why you need to brazenly lie about a well-recorded Hellenistic ruler when you could just as easily tell an honest, as of yet untold story about an actual black African queen. Or, if you absolutely insist on retelling the story of Cleopatra for the umpteenth time, why not just stick to the facts? You're doing absolutely nothing to spread awareness about the many recorded female African rulers of history, and as a result, you're doing a major disservice to both historical literacy and the very community that you seek to represent. Netflix's reason for producing this series, let alone of its choice of casting, has to an extent managed to piss off people from all factions of the culture war. To some, it's about white erasure. To others, it's about cultural appropriation. And to many more, it's just downright garbage.
The series currently sits, as of May 26, 2023, at a 20% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes.
And an audience score of just 3%, officially making it the lowest rated original series in the platform's history, and the lowest rated big-budget documentary of all time. This controversy has even gone so far as to garner backlash from countries outside of the Anglosphere, and the Western world as a whole. Some of the first outlets to report negatively on the controversy were from Greece, the people of whom are upset that such a consequential figure in Hellenistic history has gotten this kind of treatment. Even more severe is the backlash from Egyptian audiences, who are frustrated, and rightly so, that their history is being deliberately mischaracterized. The Egyptians have since vocalized that they feel as if this is an attack on their very identity, as a distinct people separate from those of other African nations, as if it's a coordinated attempt to erase their culture and their heritage. Although Cleopatra was never an Egyptian herself, nor is the current population of Egypt ethnically and civilizationally related to the men and women of ancient Egypt, the modern Egyptians nonetheless have a right to be frustrated. Despite constituting a distinct nation of their own, the Egyptians of today are nonetheless the heirs of a mighty cultural inheritance, and are the caretakers of the legacies of both the Hamitic and the Hellenistic cultures that once dominated their homeland. The backlash in Egypt has been so significant, in fact, that since the show's announcement, that Egyptian lawyer Mohammed al-Samari has even gone so far as to file a lawsuit against the streaming platform for its dubious revision of Egyptian history. And while I have no knowledge pertaining to the legal grounds upon which this lawsuit has been filed, or if it will even be successful, I think the sentiment behind it is more than justified. To this backlash, Gavari had to say, "It's not just that I've directed a series that portrays Cleopatra as black, but that I've also asked Egyptians to see themselves as Africans, and they're furious at me for that. And I'm okay with this. And you know what? More power to her. If that's where she stands, great. But that doesn't change the fact that she's managed to piss off an entire nation of people. She's asked Egyptians to see themselves as Africans, and they've said no, plain and simple. Africa is not a monolith, and never has been. Egypt is its own distinct civilization, completely divorced from the cultures of West Africa. You can't just ask people to surrender their rightful cultural inheritance to another people to which it does not belong, and expect them to do so willingly." At first glance, Netflix's Cleopatra might to some not seem like that huge of a deal. Race swapping is nothing new, and by now it's more or less become expected of Hollywood. But this is no Channel 5's Anne Boleyn, or Netflix's Vikings Valhalla. No matter how dubious the casting decisions of those respective shows and others like it might be, Cleopatra is not being marketed as some garden variety historical drama. Rather, it's being advertised as a factual, objective docuseries, and is thus incapable of justifying its creative decisions on the grounds of it being fictitious. This goes beyond being merely deceptive or irresponsible. The very existence of this series is downright dangerous. Its entire existence predicated on the deliberate spread of misinformation. Were this merely a historical drama, as cringe as it would be, we probably wouldn't be having this kind of discussion. The worst part about this entire situation is that it may very well set a precedent for future revisionist ideology-fueled projects to start marketing themselves as documentaries, when they are in fact nothing more than cleverly disguised works of fiction. Netflix, Tina Gavari, Jada Pinkett Smith, and all others who are responsible for the creation of this series, regardless of their ideological commitments, have a moral obligation to market their series as being what it truly is, a work of fiction, with no grounds in historical truth. They and people like them need to understand that, when examining history, we shouldn't analyze it on the basis of what and how we believe it should be. We need to look at it for what it is. No ifs, ands, or buts. Yes, it's true that Hollywood has a long history of casting white actors in non-white roles, but just because Hollywood ceased that practice doesn't mean that, to compensate, it has any right to go ahead and overcorrect itself by going and doing the reverse. This should be non-negotiable. No amount of whitewashing, even decades upon decades worth, can in any way, shape, or form justify even the slightest bit of black or brown washing. Quantity is irrelevant. Two wrongs don't make a right, especially when it involves the deliberate falsification of historical truth. In pursuing this project, its creators have more or less managed to achieve the impossible. They've managed to make a product that succeeds at somehow being simultaneously anti-white, anti-black, and anti-Egyptian, and, overall, broadly anti-history. Cleopatra was many things, and it's clear that her story resonates with many people across multiple ethnicities. But that doesn't change the fact that she, though technically a quote-unquote African queen, was, without any doubt whatsoever, ethnically and culturally Greek. No amount of historical revisionism can change that fact. No amount of wishful thinking can change that fact. No amount of gaslighting can change that fact. For to say that Netflix's Queen Cleopatra is faithful and accurate to history would be almost as untrue as it would be to call its producer a faithful and loving wife.